I want to turn to the presentation for this afternoon, and I've been very fortunate to work with two individuals who are presenting with me today. I've worked with them for many years, and I was happy to get them involved in this project, and I have benefited greatly from their knowledge and expertise. The first is Jordan Fairbairn, who is a professor in the Department of Sociology, King's University College Western, and she's also a CDHPIVP co-investigator. And as I mentioned, she became involved in the project as a postdoctoral fellow. We also have Danielle Sutton, who is the research coordinator at the Center for the Study of Social and Legal Responses to Violence, and a PhD candidate in sociology at the University of Guelph. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Danielle and Jordan, starting with Jordan.
Okay, thank you so much, Myrna. Thank you everyone for being here today for those powerful stories so far. I'm Jordan. I'll get things started here a bit before I hand off to Danielle and then to Myrna again. So as a bit of background for today's presentation, when we began the CDHPIVP in late 2015, we thought it might be somewhat straightforward to define domestic homicide. However, it turned out to be less straightforward than we thought. As Peter had mentioned briefly, we had this inaugural meeting with all the co-investigators, partners, and collaborators on the project at the time, followed by lengthy discussions online, helping to raise different issues and try to think through how to best lay out a definition for our project goals. And these conversations help to highlight that defining domestic homicide is not a straightforward process. It has certain implications as well, and it will have some necessary limitations. So recognizing this, what we would like to do today is to first discuss the importance of definitions to this work, reflecting on our experiences with the project. Second, to provide examples of some cases that raise some of these different issues about what to include and exclude from the domestic homicide database in particular. Then we'll move on to discuss nationwide trends and patterns from the 2010 through 2019 cases, to discuss challenges in coordinating data collection, and to identify key issues related to definitions and data among vulnerable populations specifically. And this will be part of that, the focus of the panel as well. So I would like to please note that on three of the slides 7, 8, and 9 that I'll cover, 3 case examples, I'll be discussing our domestic homicides and homicide-suicide cases. These 3 cases involve a 21-year-old woman, a 26-year-old man, and a 4-year-old child. So in the project, the CDHPIVP definition defines domestic homicide as the killing of a current or former intimate partner, their children, and or other third parties. And an intimate partner can include people who are in a current or former married, common law, or dating relationships, which we approach in a broad sense, and I'll be speaking to that further. Other third parties can include new partners, other family members, neighbors, friends, co-workers, helping professionals, bystanders, and others killed as a result of the incident. Defining domestic homicide then requires answering this question of what constitutes an intimate and or domestic relationship. So taking a step back for a moment to look to domestic violence death review committees, or DVDRCs, in some of their work. Many of you will be very familiar with these. These are the multidisciplinary advisory committees of experts that review domestic violence deaths with the underlying objectives of preventing these deaths in the future. And the work of these committees is helpful to flag some existing definitional issues, because these are sites where research and practice intersect and where definitions of domestic homicide determine what cases get studied to prevent future deaths. So looking at some of the work of DVDRCs, while LGBTQ2S+ populations and or same-sex relationships may not be generally excluded from the definitions, one issue is they're not always explicitly included either. And there are issues with the extent to which these deaths may be counted in practice. So even when theoretically included as review cases, domestic violence review processes and other institutional practices may not capture these homicides. Some DVDRCs, like the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence, have noted that the perpetrator may be listed as a friend or a roommate instead of a dating partner, for an example. We can also see this issue raised in the quote on the slide from the recently released Independent Civilian Review into Missing Persons Investigations. And the quote reads, "Officers in the MacArthur-related investigations were often unfamiliar with the missing men's communities, most particularly the LGBTQ2S+ communities and the intersection of those communities with others, such as South Asian or Muslim communities. This meant that these investigations were conducted differently at a systemic level from investigations involving affected communities within the officer's experience, expertise, or comfort zone." In terms of defining dating relationships specifically, DVDRCs have flagged issues related to defining intimacy and also the relationship duration. So questions like, is a romantic and or sexual relationship required for this to meet this definition? What about sex workers, for example? What about acquaintance relationships where a perpetrator had been rejected by a victim, but there hadn't been any existing relationship? And in terms of duration, we can think through that a relationship of some length of time may be needed to be able to identify and address risk factors for a specific victim, such as previous violence in the relationship. And age is something that also should be taken into consideration when defining who fits under the umbrella of intimate relationships. So for younger victims, adolescents, for example, there may not have been a physical or sexual relationship between those involved, or the relationship may have only lasted days or weeks. So regardless of how or where we draw these lines, it's important to articulate how intimate relationships are defined in order to be transparent about how domestic homicide cases are selected for study or review. In addition to defining intimate relationships, a second area flagged by previous work is the need to consider third parties, or those killed who are not part of the victim-perpetrator dyad. And in studying lives lost to domestic violence, we need to acknowledge what we are and who we are and aren't counting in our research in these cases. In thinking through how to define domestic homicide, what cases are included and excluded, we can think through how we are differentiating between domestic homicide, domestic violence-related homicides, and domestic violence-related deaths, as depicted in this image of the three circles on the slide. And so our project definition captured both that very narrowly defined domestic homicide inner circle, the victim and perpetrators who are current and or former intimate partners, as well as what is sometimes referred to as domestic violence related homicide, where the victim and perpetrator are neither intimate partners nor family members, but the homicide has some relationship to domestic violence. And these are the new partners, the other family members, the neighbors, the friends, the coworkers, helping professionals, bystanders, and others killed as a result of the incident. But we also want to highlight here what our project data does not capture, and this is that large outer circle of domestic violence-related deaths. Here, the death is not a homicide, but it has some relationship to domestic violence. So a World Health Organization study on women's health and domestic violence finds that domestic violence is strongly associated with suicide attempts, as one example. Additionally, the Arizona Coalition Against Domestic Violence notes that a high rate of women who are homeless report that domestic or sexual violence was the immediate cause of their homelessness. We know that some victims may die from conditions associated with living on the street, which, as the Arizona Coalition Against Domestic Violence has noted, is very difficult to trace back to their experiences of domestic violence. So, therefore, while these deaths may occur in circumstances related to domestic violence or as a long-term health consequence of domestic violence, it's very difficult often to link that cause and effect in terms of data collection. And so this image shows that even in the broadest of domestic homicide definitions, we're most certainly not capturing all lives that have been lost to domestic violence. So I'll talk about 3 case examples now. And this first case example is about dating. So The considerations and the challenges that we encountered in applying our definition, they map onto and build onto what's been found in literature and the work of DVDRCs. So in this first case, a 21-year-old woman and a 32-year-old man met on an online dating site. The accused picked her up and they went for drinks. They met that day. They returned to his place and had sex. This was described by the Crown prosecutor as a hookup. At the trial, the male accused reports that the female victim assaulted him and held a knife to his throat. The accused reported he did not remember anything after that, turned around to find the victim on the floor deceased. On trial for second-degree murder at the time of this news coverage that the data was collected from. And so this definitional consideration here is around how to define a dating relationship, right? While we intended in the project to use the term dating in a broad sense, we also want to distinguish domestic violence from violence committed by strangers, and having that prior ongoing relationship allows for, the meaningful risk assessment, safety planning, and risk management strategies. And so this case has not been included in the database to date because information about the victim and accused relationship didn't actually come out when the initial case data was gathered, but came out during the later media coverage of the trial. But this case illustrates the difficulty of drawing that line and pinpointing when a dating relationship begins, as the victim and perpetrator had only met in person on the day he killed her. The second case example is an example of a domestic violence related homicide that I referred to a couple slides ago, that second layer of the circle where the victim and perpetrator are not intimate partners, but the homicide has a relationship to domestic violence. In this case, a 26-year-old male victim was visiting his girlfriend's home, and his friend had been there too because they were worried about the ex-partner possibly showing up. After the friend left, the ex-partner did show up, forced his way in, and shot the current partner. The perpetrator was later found deceased, making this a homicide-suicide. The victim's girlfriend and her 2 children who had been in the home at the time were unharmed. So the definitional consideration here is around the third-party victim. While this case involves a victim outside of the relationship between the previous partners, this case does fall under the definition that includes the third-party victims and is included in the database. And then the final case example here involves the death of a child. In this case, a 4-year-old girl was found dead alongside her father, the presumed perpetrator of a homicide-suicide, at the bottom of an escarpment in a park. There were injuries consistent with a fall. There was no official word from police raising this issue around missing information. However, the child's mother and stepfather had no doubt that it was a homicide-suicide. There had been a contentious and lengthy custody battle that was before the courts at the time of the deaths, and a lengthy history of psychological and emotional abuse reported. And so the definitional issue here is that the case was not officially labeled a homicide. There was no perpetrator identified by police. Now, this case did occur 1 year outside the current time frame of the database, the data collected. So in that sense has not been included to date. But in a definitional sense, based on this information available, this would be included otherwise. So that will be all from me, and I'll hand things over to Danielle for the next slide.
Thank you very much, Jordan. Within this multi-phase project, one of our goals was to develop 2 unique databases that would capture domestic homicides in Canada, as per our definition discussed previously. The first houses primary data extracted from media files and supplemented with information contained in court documents where available. The second contains coroner and medical examiner data. We secured agreements with 5 jurisdictions and was able to collect data on homicides that occurred between 2010 and 2017 in each of those jurisdictions. This database, however, remains incomplete due to the challenges posed by COVID-19 in terms of data collection. Accordingly, today's presentation uses data from the first database, where we have collected and coded information on 718 domestic homicide cases that occurred over a 10-year period. Of these cases, 815 individuals lost their lives to domestic violence, and 760 accused have been identified to date. There are an additional 254 homicide victims, which may have been killed in the context of domestic violence, but due to the scarcity of detail released publicly, they have not been confirmed as such and are not included in our database. So moving along to annual trends, the figure displays shows the number of victims killed each year. Notwithstanding random fluctuations from year to year, the fewest number of victims were killed in 2016 and the highest number were documented in 2010. Over the 10-year period, an average of 82 victims were killed each year. These figures, however, likely underestimate the number of lives lost due to domestic violence as a result of the limitations inherent in the data sources used to populate the databases. Moving along to geographic trends, the largest number of domestic homicide victims were killed in Ontario, followed by Quebec and then Alberta. The fewest number of victims were killed in the Yukon, Prince Edward Island, and Northwest Territories. However, these patterns may be a product of population size and density. To account for this possibility, we calculated the rate of domestic homicide in each jurisdiction based on the population size, which provides a more accurate reflection of risk. As shown on the map, the highest rates of domestic homicide were documented in Nunavut, where the rate was calculated to signal 41 lives lost to domestic violence per 100,000 residents over the 10-year period. The next highest rates were documented in the Northwest Territories, Saskatchewan, and then Manitoba. The lowest rates were calculated for Quebec, British Columbia, and Ontario, which when combined were the locations in which 60% of all victims were killed. So moving on to the demographic characteristics of victims and accused, of the total sample, the largest proportion of adult victims were female, and they were killed primarily by a male accused. Both victims and accused had an average age of 41 years. Continuing our focus on adult victims, 88% shared an intimate partner relationship with their accused, almost 2/3 of which were in a current relationship. Of these intact unions, almost an equal proportion of victims and accused were in a common law relationship or legally married at the time of the homicide, whereas a smaller percentage were dating. 1/4 of all victims were estranged from their accused. Separation, whether actual or pending, is a documented risk factor of lethal violence occurring. Among the 63% of cases in which the victim and accused were in a current relationship, there was evidence that separation was imminent in 1/4 of all these cases analyzed. The remaining 12% of victims shared another non-intimate type of relationship with their accused. This category often captures the deaths of third parties or collateral victims, such as other family members, strangers, or friends of the primary victim and/or accused. Turning now to incident characteristics, and in alignment with the most common relationship shared, most victims died in a private location, either the residence the victim shared with their accused, their own home, or the home of the accused. Just over 1/4 were killed in public or semi-private locations or in an unknown or unreported location. Based on the information made public, the largest proportion of victims died by stabbing, followed by firearms injuries, beatings, or by strangulation. Almost half of all victims were killed using excessive force, which is defined as the repeated use of one method or the use of multiple methods, such as a killing involving stabbing as well as beating. Of the 760 accused identified, just over 1/5 died by suicide, 98% of which were male. Of those who died by suicide, the most commonly reported methods involved firearms injuries, followed by stabbing and death by hanging. Many of these characteristics, however, differed across vulnerable populations, to which we now turn. So over half of all the victims killed were identified as belonging to one or more of the 4 vulnerable populations focused upon by the CDHPIVP. Again, these figures underestimate the number of domestic homicide victims who belonged to at least one vulnerable group due to data restrictions and the lack of information reported publicly. For example, when relying exclusively on public documents, it was not always possible to determine whether victims were Indigenous or belonged to an immigrant or refugee group. Moreover, especially in cases of homicide followed by suicide, the context of the killing was not always reported, which likely resulted in an undercount of the number of children killed in the context of domestic violence. This is because it was not always possible to determine whether a child was killed as a result of intervening in a domestic violence episode, whether they were killed as an act of revenge, whether within the context of a custody battle, or whether their death was at the direction of a parent or guardian, as per our definitional criteria. Despite these limitations, intersectionality was still apparent for many of the victims killed. Specifically, of the 103 Indigenous victims, 66% were killed in a rural, remote, or northern area of the country, and 10% were children. There was a small degree of documented intersectionality among immigrant and refugee victims, where of the 128 killed, 5% lived in a rural, remote, or northern area, and 5% were children. Of the 252 rural, remote, and northern victims, 27% were identified as Indigenous, 3% as immigrants or refugees, and 13% were children. Finally, of the 74 children killed in the context of domestic violence, almost half lived in a rural, remote, or northern area of the country, 14% were Indigenous, and 8% were immigrants or refugees. Therefore, as depicted on this slide, there was such a high degree of intersectionality observed among the four vulnerable populations that we cannot assume that the risk factors and barriers commonly experienced by one population are not applicable to the others. While the upcoming results are similar to many trends documented in the total sample, there were many aspects that were unique to one population or varied across the four groups. Accordingly, efforts will be made to highlight such variance. Moving on to victim characteristics among the vulnerable populations, females comprised the greatest proportion of all victims, but there was some variation documented. Specifically, females comprised a very large proportion of immigrant and refugee victims, but comprised a comparatively smaller proportion of children killed in the context of domestic violence, where a fairly even gender split was observed, and just over half of all the victims were female. Variation was also documented among the age of victims. So ages of immigrant and refugee victims, as well as those killed in rural, remote, and northern areas of the country, aligned with the average age of adult victims in the total sample. Indigenous victims, on the other hand, were younger on average than other domestic homicide victims, aside from children, of course, by approximately 10 years. This finding aligns with their demographic makeup in the general population, where a large proportion of Indigenous peoples are, on average, younger than their non-Indigenous counterparts. Moving on to the characteristics of the accused, most were male, but again, variation was documented. Males comprised a very large proportion of accused in immigrant and refugee cases, and a comparatively smaller proportion of accused were male in cases involving Indigenous victims. The accused age ranged from 33 to 43 years old, where individuals accused of killing Indigenous victims and children were younger on average than other accused. Older ages were documented among individuals accused of killing immigrant and refugee victims and those who were killed while residing in rural, remote, and northern areas of the country, both of which exceeded the average accused age documented in the total sample. Finally, the frequency of suicide appeared to vary by vulnerable population, the highest rates of which were documented among individuals accused of killing children. Specifically, half of all these accused died by suicide. In comparison, those who killed Indigenous victims were least likely, as only 10% of these accused died by suicide. Both figures contrast sharply with figures documented in the total sample, in which 21% of all accused died by suicide. This figure better aligns with the rate of suicide among accused who killed immigrant and refugee victims, where 20% of these accused died by suicide. The rate of suicide was slightly higher among accused who killed a victim in a rural, remote, or northern area of the country, where 1/3 of all accused died by suicide. So moving along, paralleling trends in the total sample, the largest proportion of accused were in a current intimate partner relationship with their victim, regardless of the vulnerable population. Across these populations, however, the largest proportion of current relationships was documented among Indigenous victims, a proportion which exceeded what was documented in the total sample. In contrast, estranged relationships were most commonly documented for immigrant and refugee victims. Delving deeper into relationship, the most common type, which is defined as whether the victim or accused were dating in a common law relationship or legally married, varied across the vulnerable populations. For Indigenous victims, the largest proportion were in a common law relationship with their accused. Among immigrant and refugee victims, the largest proportion was legally married to their accused. Over 1/3 of rural, remote, and northern victims were in a common law relationship, followed closely by those who were legally married to their accused. And finally, most children killed in the context of domestic violence were the biological child of the accused. So based on the method of the information available, the method of killing varied across vulnerable populations. Stabbing was the most commonly documented method of killing for both Indigenous and immigrant refugee victims, whereas firearms injuries was the most common for victims killed in rural, remote, and northern locations, as well as children killed in the context of domestic violence. Individuals accused of killing the latter two groups also had the highest documented rates of suicide. It may be that a correlation exists between firearm accessibility and ownership, as well as firearm-related domestic homicides and firearm-related suicide, a speculation that is currently supported by academic research. Other common methods of killing varied across the populations. For example, in comparison with other groups, comparatively fewer Indigenous victims died by firearms injuries and more died by beatings than what was observed among other vulnerable populations. In contrast, children were the only group where arson was a commonly documented method of killing. So to summarize, the data revealed how certain characteristics, such as the gendered nature of domestic violence, the location of homicide, relationship type, and status were common in the total sample and across the vulnerable populations. However, other noteworthy differences emerged with respect to the vulnerable populations. For example, common law relations were frequent among Indigenous peoples, and legal marriages were common for immigrants and refugees. Children and victims killed in rural and remote and northern areas appear to be at increased risk of dying by firearms, and suicide is especially common among individuals accused of committing domestic homicides of these two groups. These documented differences can therefore be used to inform prevention initiatives among domestic homicides in general and those specific to vulnerable populations. So having reviewed key findings related to domestic homicides in general and among vulnerable populations specifically, I now turn it over to Myrna to discuss the challenges of documenting domestic homicide. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle. So lots of information has been given over the last half hour or so. So I just want to highlight here that, again, the slides will be available. And we also have a report that I will tell you how to locate before we leave today. So what I want to focus on in concluding here are some of the challenges that we identified in documenting domestic homicide. And so I want to start with, as Jordan noted, that we spent some time coming to a consensus on our definition, more time than I thought we would actually want to spend or needed to spend, but it was an amazing, rich discussion that landed on the definition that we did eventually use. But it does remain difficult to align definitional parameters used across disciplines and jurisdictions. And as Jordan has noted, we continue to run into cases that we have to sort of decide on a case-by-case basis. So there's no perfect definition we found. Another challenge has been the issue around privacy and confidentiality. And this is a key challenge for all types of sector responses to domestic violence in terms of understanding what privacy legislation exists across the country and how it varies across provinces and territories, as well as with around confidentiality issues, because we are dealing with multiple sectors who all have to be concerned around confidentiality. So these issues came up when we were sort of communicating with the coroner and medical examiner data, and noticed that there was variations in privacy across the country and privacy legislation, et cetera. So it is a key challenge, but one that can be overcome. So some of the general limitations, I'm going to go through a few of them here, and then I'm going to focus on the specific populations. So, limitations have to do with both availability and accessibility of data. So, availability means that there's data, but they're not actually accessible to those who can use it to inform violence prevention, which is not a good situation. But then if the data is available, the data may often be limited in terms of what information is available, or some information that we would like to see is non-existent. So some of the issues or the limitations that we faced were the variations by type of homicide. So, for example, again, we were going from media reports and court documents. So if we had a homicide-suicide, clearly this does not go through the court system because the perpetrator died by suicide or the accused died by suicide. And so that means that we're relying on media coverage. And often the media coverage can be quite limited in these types of cases. We also saw variations in the characteristics of those involved. So depending on where it occurred, for example, if it was a remote or northern community, we may not be able to get as much information. Depending on the population that we were focusing on, sometimes information seemed limited when it comes to Indigenous populations or immigrant and refugee populations. And again, I'm going to come up with some examples in a moment. The data quality and completeness was often low. So we know that prior violence and separation is clearly a risk factor or a red flag for domestic homicide. But often the information we need around separation, such as did it actually occur, was it a decision that was made and communicated to the accused, but they didn't actually physically separate, or about the prior violence. Was it physical violence? Was it coercive controlling violence and likely not documented if such, financial abuse, etc. So the quality was often low for the key variables that we need information on. There was also an inability to capture information on key social identities, which we know compound marginalization and vulnerability to domestic homicide. And in this project, we had two key lenses that we wanted to look at domestic homicide through, and one was intersectionality. But it was very difficult to get much beyond some of the variables that we focused on and Danielle has talked about in terms of some of the intersecting identities. And then finally, in general, there was an emphasis on individual rather than community or societal level factors. And the latter are often particularly important, as I'll talk about in a moment, for looking at the groups that we did with respect to their risk and safety. And this is the social ecological lens through which we also looked at domestic homicide. And then finally, time and resources required to sustain data collection over time is quite significant in terms of being able to keep the data updated over time as new information becomes available. So how did this play out for some of the specific groups? As I mentioned, media coverage was often brief, with missing detail, particularly around victim-accused relationship, especially if the Indigenous populations were in remote or northern communities. And for some reason, this has become more of an issue over time. The more we rely on these data, particularly from media, it seems the less information seems to be released by those who are issuing press releases. So I'm not sure if there's a structural issue around this, but it's something that we want to pay attention to. The cases of missing and murdered women where domestic violence may have played a role often remain unsolved, so we don't know for sure, or they may not have been identified as domestic homicide based on the information that we had access to. There was an overemphasis, again, on individual factors rather than community-level factors that are really key when we want to think about risk and safety, such as poverty, lack of basic resources, such as clean drinking water, culturally appropriate services, such as the availability of Indigenous women-led responses to violence, and some of the simple and more practical things, such as public transportation to access services. So we didn't often have information on that, which are factors at the community level which would play a role. And then again, at the societal level, we weren't able to document what we know is a key contributor to violence in Indigenous communities, and that's the ongoing legacy of colonization, which shapes significantly the context in which this violence occurs and the related experiences of racism and discrimination, not only when they seek help, when they help seek, but also in terms of the services available to them. So when we look at rural, remote, and northern populations, there was a lack of consensus around what is rural, remote, and northern. And we landed on some definitions around that that still vary across the country, but rural was a community or a geographic location with less than 10,000. Remote was a community or location that was not accessible by road year-round. And northern was a community or geographic location designated so by the provincial government as being northern. So clearly, there's lots of problems with that, but we did land on what we thought was rural, remote, and northern in terms of our assessments. But again, there's not a lot of consensus around this. As we saw from Danielle's presentation, rural, remote, and northern often overlap with other identities. Indigenous, immigrant, refugee children, often intersected with whether they were rural, remote, and northern. Again, like Indigenous populations, we had an overemphasis on getting access to individual level factors, which precluded the examination of things like the social and geographic isolation. And there was a lack of data on accessibility and availability of guns, as we know was a key issue in rural communities, so legal or otherwise. So it was difficult to examine in more detail how this played a role. And then finally, remote location hindered help seeking, and we know this may increase potential for collateral victims. And we have a familicide homicide brief which captures those in which multiple victims were killed, which shows that this is more often likely to occur in rural, remote, and northern communities. With respect to immigrant and refugee populations, narrow definitions may not capture the dynamics for families from what are often perceived as more collectivist cultures, where concepts of family unity, honor, and shame may be key to understanding risk and safety. For example, power control and victim vulnerability could be key with these types of homicides because social isolation does not just stem from perhaps geographic isolation, but also from cultural and linguistic barriers. The dynamics of domestic violence within parent-child and in-law relationships may also be particularly important to explore for this population, but there's little data. And again, the emphasis on individual level risk factors and culture preclude an examination of how community and societal level racism and discrimination impact their experiences of and responses to violence. And finally, with respect to children, there's a lack of information overall about children and the exposure of children and the involvement of children in media and court files, specifically around motive. And this means that it's often difficult to determine if there's a link to domestic violence involving the mother. So often if a child is killed in the context of by a parent, for example, we would assume there's domestic violence to some degree, but whether or not it's a link to the mother, we often don't have information on that if the mother herself is not killed. We know that family court proceedings are key to understanding these cases, but information is not often available and rarely available from the data sources that we were accessing. We also know that children may be killed in a variety of different contexts when it comes to domestic violence, and they could have been attempting to protect a parent during a violent episode, which we saw cases of this. They could have been part of an overall murder-suicide plan by the parent, primarily the father, who kills an entire family, as well as the female partner, but not always, or as revenge against a partner who decided to end a relationship or for some other perceived betrayal. And even beyond this, when we think of children killed in the context of domestic violence, we're not capturing all the information that would be so pertinent for children who survive witnessing or experiencing domestic violence in the home, because they do witness horrific trauma and lose both parents to death and jail or to murder-suicide. So just to recap some of the key takeaways from the presentation that Danielle and Jordan and I provided today is that all definitions have limitations in capturing the full pictures of lives lost to domestic violence, but we were able to actually, with the parameters that we used, to collect some data on what was very clearly domestic homicides in general and specific to vulnerable groups to varying degrees. So sometimes there was varying information available across the 4 vulnerable populations that we focused on. Looking at domestic homicide in the context of vulnerable populations reveals that there are specific definitional issues that we do need to consider, that we can't really, it's not a one-size definition scenario. In research and practice, a central challenge is to balance inclusiveness with the need to make meaningful risk assessment, risk management, and safety planning recommendations. And I draw back your attention back to the examples provided by Jordan in terms of those cases, and if they do provide information that we would want to access around risk and safety. And then as a final and a key takeaway is that an intersectional multi-level approach with attention to structural factors or social structural factors, such as systemic marginalization, colonization, racism, poverty, remains a key yet unattainable goal with the current data that we're using. And that really is one of the key limitations that we faced with this particular project, recognizing the impact of these societal level and community level factors, but not being able to document them. So we hope that our presentation has provided you with some food for thought. I want to thank my co-presenters, Danielle and Jordan, for their discussions around the definitions and the data. I want to draw your attention to the fact that we do have our slides available, and our report is also available that goes into much more detail than what we presented here today.